Fear and Hunger Termina is everything I could have wanted from a Fear and Hunger sequel. It has more complex characters, it's easier to navigate menus, the soundtrack is amazing, and it has the same insane design philosophy as the first game. The only thing I think is a downgrade is the surprising number of typos and spelling mistakes, but for the sake of both my sanity and this video, I'll pretend that doesn't bother me. This game is a lot more focused on the psychology and motivations of the player characters than the first game was. It also focuses more on the theme of people becoming corrupted versions of themselves. The first game had an element of this, with the God of the Depths influencing the staff of the dungeons. The influence of the God of the Depths made people like the guards and Crow Mauler into beings of pure libido and destrudo, while the influence of Rare in the second game creates more individualized and complex beings, and isn't limited to enemies. NPCs and player characters can be affected by Rare, and I think this helps add depth to those characters. Today I want to talk about my own interpretations of the Moonscorch contestants, and how I think the concept of moonscorching relates to the lore and grander themes of the Fear and Hunger series. Also, here's a disclaimer to say that these are just my interpretations. I am not the first person to make a video about the Moonscorched, and I'm sure I won't be the last. Feel free to disagree with me or let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Also, this video won't include August or Pav because at time of writing they don't have Moonscorched forms. Let's start with the Gentleman, as he's likely the first Moonscorched contestant the player will meet. The Gentleman is one of the more coherent Moonscorched forms. He's able to communicate with ease, but there's clear dissonance between how he views himself and how he actually appears. He acts proper and sophisticated and wants to discuss art and poetry, but he appears monstrous. There's also a suppressed sexual element to the Gentleman. He kidnaps Marina, but doesn't do anything to her. He serves all of these extremely phallic dishes to the player, but is offended if you point out that the food looks like sex organs. Henryk, while he's still himself, clearly has an interest in women and sex. He catcalls Abella and mentions having a fling in the past, but we know he's also a failed artist turned chef. Henryk has this self-image of someone highly sophisticated, but also has these suppressed desires that make him appear improper. The Gentleman is a combination of his ideal self-image and the undesirable aspects of his personality that he tries to suffocate. Mechanical dance is a form that lacks the presence of an ideal self-image and is instead a being of pure insecurity. It displays Olivia's insecurity about being wheelchair-bound. In this form, the chair has become a part of her, and she cries, "I've always been this way," even though we know she didn't get the wheelchair until she was a teenager. Her lower half also appears more machine-like, likely representing feelings of jealousy towards her sister's knowledge of machinery and technology. Weeping Scope is one of the saddest Moonscorched forms. It's very literal and straightforward. Levi sees himself as a weapon since that's how he was seen by others as a teenager. He also appears curled up and nude. This could represent a return to infancy since his entire childhood was lost due to abuse and the military. Alternatively, the lack of genitals could represent a disconnect he feels from sex after being in the orphanage. The Sylvian Circle in the orphanage and the fight with a naked Father Hugo carry some implications with them, so it's possible that Levi wishes those parts of himself didn't exist. The monster is pretty straightforward in a lot of ways. Caligura is a predator. He tries to assault Abella and is clearly more interested in his own gratification than the feelings of others. The monster is a giant sex organ who is asking the player to pleasure him. On top of being about sexual gratification, his demand of service is also related to his desire for domination in a more general sense. There's a scene where Caligura asks Levi to lick his shoes clean. Caligura is a sadist. He enjoys humiliating others to boost his own ego. The Cocoon is all about the relationship between Marina and her father. In this form, Marina isn't merely a transformed being, but a host for the Cocoon, a mass of bagged flesh representing the remains of her father's body. He's a controlling force here, which is what he wanted to be over Marina, and was something that Marina tried to escape from. Here she is seen as a force for his life instead of her own. Something of note is that Marina's head appears between her legs. This could represent her own dysphoria over having male sex organs, or another representation of her father's desires. He wanted what was in between her ears to match what was in between her legs. Judgment is another one that's pretty straightforward. Tanaka is a salaryman who is clearly concerned about his job. His moon-scorched form has broken through the proverbial glass ceiling, an act that has left him broken and bleeding. The glass piercing into his skin also evokes imagery of self-harm, like jumping through a window or landing on a windshield. He's holding a whip as if he is his own master, forcing himself to do labor by causing himself pain. Dysmorphia is radiating. She's big and bright and open, which contrasts to Samarie's shy personality. Samarie is seen hiding and running away on multiple occasions, but here she is demanding attention. This form is all about revealing who she is. The skin on her face is split open and pulled back, and the skin on her body is translucent. This transparency, on top of being a way of revealing herself, could also represent the withering away of her body as the 9th circle has reduced her lifespan. It's not surprising that Samarie feels a disconnect between her and her body after being treated more like an object than a person in Vatican City. The giant is a brutish and violent creature, which is not at all what Marcoh is. Much like Olivia and Levi, Marcoh's moon-scorched form reveals his insecurity more so than his actual desires or personality. The Marcoh we see in the game is kind. He helps Olivia, he tries to stop party members who are committing murder, and his backstory reveals that much of his life has been spent protecting his younger sister. But to an outside observer, Marcoh's stature might make him appear more like a thug than a gentle giant. And Marcoh's own history of violence has distorted his own self-image. Marcoh is a killer, but only because he wasn't given much of a choice. It was either kill for the mafia or let his sister die at the hands of Ricardo. Marcoh is a victim of circumstance, but his moon-scorched cry of guilt, guilt, guilt reveals how he feels about the whole ordeal. Mastermind is, relatively speaking, very human. That is, if you ignore the large exposed brain that's consuming Osa's head. Osa reminds me a lot of Enki, but with a higher charisma score. I guess this isn't surprising since they both have the enlightened soul. I think a key difference is that while Enki was a bit of a selfish bastard, he was far more interested in knowledge than he was in power, whereas Osa is kind of the opposite. His moon-scorched form has the ability to regenerate lost limbs, which I think represents Osa's desire to be an unbeatable force. While the exposed brain might be a symbol of victory, a symbol that he has become the mastermind pursuing his own goals, the fact that the brain has enveloped him could represent the corruption that his desires may foster, or a fear of being under someone else's control. Much like Henryk, Karin's moon-scorched form is a mix between how she wants to see herself and how she actually feels. A Valkyrie is a mythological being that guides the souls of deceased soldiers to heaven. Karin, a journalist who has covered wars, there, I did it, I said the thing, wants to think of herself that way. But the form she takes is more reminiscent of a vulture, a creature that benefits from the death of others. The soldiers on her back also look like the Belland enemies, phallic-looking soldiers who presumably have Bremen ties. If this is in fact the case, the fact that she's, supposedly, carrying them to heaven might represent a sort of cognitive dissonance she feels by showing respect to Bremen, aka a place where she grew up, but a place where she despises the leadership and military. Alternatively, if it's the vulture reading, she might, subconsciously or not, enjoy benefiting from the downfall of the Bremens. Okay, here's where I'll admit that there are some gaps in my analysis. I'm a little bit lost on Shognar, just because I don't think any aspect of the creature relates to Abella's character history. That being said, this is a complex game with tons and tons of interactions, so even though I've tried to do my due diligence, it's possible that there's something I missed that explains everything. In the meantime, I still do have some theories. The most common one I've heard is that Shognar's big and bulky appearance is tied to Abella's insecurity about having a traditionally masculine job. After playing the game myself, I actually think it might be the opposite. Abella is, without a doubt, the most sexualized character within the game. Henryk catcalls her and tries to flirt with her, Caligura tries to assault her, and if you confess to Osa that you have feelings for someone on the train, he assumes it's the girl with red hair. I'm wondering if it's possible that Shognar appears so bulky and menacing because Abella would rather be feared than sexualized. Shognar is an expression of power in a world where she may feel powerless. If you have Dawn in your party, he can perform medical diagnosis and states that the thing on her face could be a parasite. This is probably similar to the parasite on the woodsman, which is unambiguously a phallic symbol. The presence of this symbol on Abella could contribute to either the uncomfortable with masculinity reading or the uncomfortable with feminine sexuality reading. Either way, I still think it's a kind of ambiguous reading based more on other characters than on Abella. So now that we're done talking about the elephant, I think it's time we talked about the cat in the room. During Don's character history, it's stated that his parents were members of a Sylvian cult, who donned rabbit masks and performed rituals in the woods. If you've played the first game, you know exactly what this means, and if you haven't played the first game, you can still figure it out through context clues. Once you learn that Sylvian is the god of love and fertility, it probably clicks into place. And this is deeply disturbing because there's a part in Don's history that contains the line, "To make it worse, they even tried to pass on the healing gift of Sylvian to you." This has some pretty dark implications, and I think those implications are meant to be taken as fact, because Don turns into Pocket Cat. Pocket Cat is a character in both games. He's a merchant and a servant of Rare who takes severed heads or human children as payment, depending on which game you're playing. He's also an in-universe fairy tale figure who punishes children who disobey their parents. Pocket Cat is also a sexually perverse character. He speaks in innuendo, he pleasures himself in front of the player, and in the first game it is implied that he is a word I cannot say on YouTube, so I'll put it on the screen right now. Don is a representation of the cycle of abuse. He hated his parents and he hated his life with them, but he ends up transforming into a carrier of the abuse that was inflicted on him as a child. Also, if you haven't played Fear and Hunger Termina, it's actually really hard for me to describe how off-putting and disturbing this reveal is. Don is the only character who transforms into a pre-existing character, and the Pocket Cat has been established as one of the evilest characters in the entire fucking franchise. Watching this happen to the helpful doctor character is sad, gross, and creepy in a way that is entirely intentional and honestly kind of perfect for a tragic horror story. Don's transformation into Pocket Cat is also different than the other Moonscorch scenes. Most other characters will express discomfort and then just morph into their Moonscorched form. If taken to the tower, Don will start talking to Pocket Cat even though no one else can see him. Don will say, "This is the only way to get answers? Fine, I accept your proposal." This implies that he made a deal with Pocket Cat, presumably agreeing to possession in order to learn what happened to his wife and father-in-law. However, if Dan Moonscorches because you slept until day 4, he has an interaction with Pocket Cat in which Pocket Cat doesn't offer an exchange, but instead convinces Don that this is who he always was. Pocket Cat calls Don dirty and degenerate, among other things, and treats the passing of the torch less as a possession and more of a transformation, or rather a reveal, of Don. At least, this is how the two of them perceive it. Don's history is what led him here. The abuse inflicted by his parents and the tragedy of what happened to Elise and the Baron made him susceptible to Pocket Cat's influence. He's also the only character who still transforms in his B ending. It's like his entire life was a tragedy orchestrated by the gods to ensure he ends up in this position, where transforming into a monster becomes his only option. The two different ways he transforms reveals a dichotomy that I think is present with every contestant in the festival. Are the Moonscorched forms a result of the inner self or forces we can't control? Which is more frightening? Which is more comforting? I think it's deliberately ambiguous, and like all dichotomies, it's a false one. While Don's moonscorching is different than the others in terms of lore, the other moonscorched forms are also shaped by their pasts, their secrets, and their inner feelings. Maybe it isn't their orchestrated destiny, but it is their ultimate tragic fate. There's the duality within the self, the pieces of ourself that we love and respect, and the pieces of ourselves that we wish we could get rid of. This is present in some of the moonscorched forms, but it's clearly present in another scorched character. Not one scorched by the moon, but scorched in the burning pit of sulfur. If you take Black Caliph to the rare dimension and carve enough idols of yourself, the man in black tells you that he was there when Alll-mer, who is the Fear and Hunger universe's version of Christ, carved a being from his subconscious. This was a way of distancing himself from his own imperfection. This imperfect being was cast into the pits of sulfur so that Alll-mer could truly ascend. But the man in black poses a question. Who was really cast away? The conscious or the subconscious? Which side will prevail? I tend to like works of fiction that are thematically coherent, the type where many different story elements all tie back to the same theme. The Fear and Hunger series has many different themes, but they all sort of bleed into each other. There's creation and destruction, concepts that are embodied by the old gods Sylvian and Grogoroth, and in how the ages of modern history rebuild after the old ones crumble. There's destiny and circumstance. People like Dawn or the girl from the first game have these fates designed by the gods, but also born from their own experiences. There's the concept of the greater good versus the people who suffer due to the pursuit of such a thing. Lagarde and his pursuits of a unified world contrasting with the suffering he inflicts as he becomes the Kaiser. Ascension and corruption. Alll-mer and his cursed counterpart, and the Moonscorched and their altered forms. All of these conflicting forces that are born of how the gods and the humans shape the world of Fear and Hunger. I think all of this stuff does fall under one thesis, and this is summarized by the Man in Black. Good on one hand and evil on the other. Good can come from bad places, just as bad can come from the good. A constant struggle. A game, even. It's about duality and contradicting forces that cannot exist without their counterparts. It's also about repetition, how the old gods, the new gods, and the humans always seem to find themselves trapped in these struggles. The old gods influence humanity. The new gods are overthrown and retire to their grand hall. A young woman ascends to godhood. The prophesized man fails to reach his full potential, and the moon god's servant lives on as both myth and merchant. All of this has happened before, and it will all happen again. In the words of Francois the Dominating, another cycle is to begin. So yeah, I can't wait for Fear and Hunger 3. So what are your thoughts? What do you think of the Moonscorched forms, and how do you think they tie into the themes of the story? Let me know in the comments, and tell the YouTube algorithm you liked this video by either liking or subscribing. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!